Imagine being locked away in a hidden basement. No windows, no sunlight, only concrete walls pressing in around you. The air is cold, the silence broken only by distant footsteps above, reminding you that the world continues while you remain trapped in darkness. Days turn into years, and the outside world becomes nothing more than a memory. This is the kind of story that forces us to picture what life would feel like in such unimaginable confinement. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Elisabeth Fritzl was born on April 6, 1966, in Amstetten, a small town in Lower Austria. She was the eldest daughter of Joseph Fritzl, a factory worker, and Rosemary Fritzl, a housewife. To outsiders, the Fritzl family seemed ordinary, even respectable. Joseph was seen as polite and meticulous, a quiet man who kept to himself. Rosemary appeared compliant and devoted to her household duties. Elisabeth had 6 siblings and, as the eldest, carried responsibilities typical for her age, helping with chores and assisting around the house. From an early age, Elisabeth lived under her father's strict rules. Joseph maintained rigid control over the household, and his authoritarian nature was evident in daily life. Neighbors would later describe him as distant and commanding, while Elisabeth was quiet, obedient, and withdrawn. She attended local schools in Amstetten, where teachers remembered her as compliant but reserved. She had friends in the neighborhood, but her father limited her social interactions and movements outside the home. In the community, the Fritzls presented a conventional image. Joseph's technical skills and work at a local factory reinforced the perception of him as a law-abiding, dependable man. Neighbors often praised the family's outward normalcy, a facade that concealed the darkness that would later come to light. After Elisabeth's captivity was revealed, retrospective investigations highlighted missed warning signs. Neighbors had occasionally noted her unusual isolation and fearful demeanor around her father. School records reflected sporadic attendance, though at the time no formal investigations were initiated. From the outside, her life seemed typical, yet the combination of strict familial control, limited social contact, and her father's outward respectability quietly laid the groundwork for the decades of abuse that would follow. As Elisabeth grew older, subtle signs of control and restriction became more apparent, though they remained largely unnoticed by outsiders. Joseph Fritzl's authoritarian personality increasingly dictated the rhythm of the household. He controlled who the children interacted with, limited Elisabeth's social life, and closely monitored her movements. Neighbors later recalled that Elisabeth rarely played freely outside or engaged in the typical activities of teenagers in the town. Her behavior was quiet and cautious, reflecting a deep-seated fear of her father. Within the family, Joseph enforced a strict hierarchy. Elisabeth, as the eldest, was expected to assist with household duties and ensure that her younger siblings complied with the rules. Observers noted that while the family appeared orderly, Elisabeth seemed unusually subdued, rarely expressing her opinions or emotions openly. Teachers remembered her as a capable student but noted her reserved nature and tendency to avoid drawing attention to herself. There were no official reports of abuse at the time, but in retrospect, some neighbors recalled small, unsettling details. Elisabeth often seemed withdrawn, and there were rare instances when her father's domineering behavior extended into public interactions, casting a shadow over her childhood. Social services had no records of intervention, and any potential signs of abuse were either unnoticed or dismissed. This period established a pattern of isolation and control that would later escalate into Joseph Fritzl's ultimate act of imprisonment. Elisabeth's compliance and fear, combined with her father's outwardly respectable image, allowed him to maintain dominance without attracting scrutiny. The groundwork for her confinement was laid not through a single dramatic event, but through years of calculated control and subtle restriction, shaping her into someone who could be entirely contained when the time came. By the early 1980s, Elisabeth was a young adult, and Joseph Fritzl's control over her life had intensified. Neighbors later described that she rarely ventured beyond the family home alone, and her movements were often accompanied by her father or tightly monitored. Friends and schoolmates reported that she had become increasingly withdrawn, sometimes vanishing from social events without explanation. Her compliance appeared absolute, a product of years of psychological dominance rather than overt physical abuse at this stage. Within the household, Joseph's authoritarian grip extended beyond typical parental discipline. Elisabeth's daily life was heavily regulated. She was expected to perform household chores meticulously and adhere to her father's strict rules. Any display of independence, however minor, was discouraged or met with intimidation. Friends who attempted to maintain contact found Elisabeth evasive, a reflection of the fear and control that permeated her home life. Investigations following her eventual captivity revealed that this period was crucial in preparing her for confinement. The patterns of obedience, social withdrawal, and fear were not merely incidental. They were reinforced by Joseph's systematic control. Experts later noted that such psychological conditioning, over several years, made Elisabeth more vulnerable to the extreme abuse that would follow. Despite the subtlety of these behaviors, retrospective accounts highlighted warning signs that were missed by those around her. Neighbors occasionally commented on her unusual isolation, and school records showed gaps in attendance. Yet there were no formal investigations or interventions, and the community continued to perceive the Fritzls as an ordinary family. These missed opportunities underscored a systemic failure to recognize early indicators of abuse, allowing Joseph Fritzl to maintain unchecked control over Elisabeth's life. In 1984, when Elisabeth was 18 years old, Joseph Fritzl's control escalated to its most extreme form. Over the course of several days, he lured her into a part of the family home that had been specially modified. A concealed basement, constructed beneath the house with heavy doors, reinforced walls, and minimal ventilation. The basement was designed to be completely isolated from the rest of the home, a fact that would later shock investigators. Elisabeth was held against her will in this space for the first time, marking the beginning of a confinement that would last 24 years in total, 18 of them spent continuously in captivity. The basement included several small rooms, some intended for sleeping, others for storage, and one configured to serve as a makeshift living area. She had no freedom of movement beyond this space. Joseph maintained total control over access, entering only to provide basic necessities and to enforce his authority. The physical and psychological impact was immediate. Elisabeth was cut off from all contact with the outside world, separated from her family and friends, and prevented from attending school or social gatherings. Reports from survivors and investigators later revealed that she was initially terrified, confused, and compliant, recognizing that her father held absolute power over her environment. Her fear was reinforced by the basement's confinement, the isolation from daylight, and the knowledge that escape seemed impossible. Neighbors and friends of the family did not suspect anything unusual. Joseph maintained his public image as a quiet, respectable man, visiting workplaces and social events as normal, while Elisabeth's absence was explained away or went unnoticed. No authorities were alerted at the time, and the basement remained a hidden prison. The meticulous planning and execution of this confinement allowed Joseph Fritzl to act without interference, demonstrating a chilling combination of premeditation, secrecy, and control. Once Elisabeth was confined, Joseph Fritzl implemented a system to ensure total domination. She had no access to clocks, calendars, or any means of measuring time, leaving her disoriented and entirely dependent on him. The basement structure prevented any sound from escaping, and Joseph ensured that neighbors and family above were unaware of her presence. Any attempts at questioning or resistance were met with intimidation, reinforcing her submission. Medical records later revealed that Elisabeth's physical health was closely monitored, but only minimally. She received basic food, water, and clothing, but there were no medical visits unless Joseph chose to permit them. Over time, he limited her mobility and social contact further, isolating her from potential sources of support. Investigators noted that this isolation was a deliberate tactic, designed to erode her autonomy and enforce compliance. During this initial period of confinement, Elisabeth's father maintained normal interactions with the outside world. He continued working at his factory job and attended social gatherings, projecting the image of a responsible family man. Friends and neighbors noted Elisabeth's absence but did not question it publicly. This combination of careful planning, technical preparation of the basement, and psychological manipulation allowed Joseph to sustain Elisabeth's imprisonment without detection for years. Subsequent investigations would describe the basement as a near-impenetrable space. Reinforced doors, barred windows, and hidden access points. It was designed to prevent escape and conceal evidence of his crimes. Experts later characterized it as a highly controlled environment that reflected meticulous premeditation. Elisabeth's captivity was not spontaneous. It was the result of long-term planning that leveraged both her psychological conditioning and the physical isolation of the basement. Elisabeth's life in the basement was defined by isolation and routine, imposed entirely by her father. She was confined to small, windowless rooms with minimal light and limited ventilation, cut off from the natural rhythms of day and night. Food, clothing, and hygiene were provided only when Joseph chose to supply them, and Elisabeth had no agency over her environment. Over time, the psychological impact of this confinement became profound, leaving her fearful, submissive, and dependent on her captor for every need. Daily life was monotonous and tightly controlled. Joseph determined when she could eat, when she could sleep, and when she could move within the basement. Elisabeth had no access to education, books, or media beyond what her father allowed. Investigators later noted that her social and cognitive stimulation was deliberately restricted, a factor that exacerbated the psychological control he exerted. Any attempts to resist or seek help were met with threats, intimidation, or physical punishment, reinforcing the absolute power he held over her. Despite the severe isolation, Elisabeth's survival depended on adapting to the constraints imposed upon her. She learned to live within the confined space, managing her daily needs and conserving energy. Over the years, she also had to cope with the psychological trauma of being entirely cut off from her family, friends, and the outside world. Experts who reviewed her case noted that prolonged isolation of this type typically leads to profound effects on mental health, including anxiety, depression, and learned helplessness, all of which were evident in her later accounts. Joseph continued to maintain a facade of normalcy in the community, working and interacting publicly while keeping Elisabeth's imprisonment secret. Neighbors and extended family remained unaware of her absence. The basement itself was carefully designed and maintained to prevent discovery, with reinforced doors, hidden access points, and soundproofing. The combination of physical confinement, psychological manipulation, and public deception allowed Joseph to sustain Elisabeth's captivity for over a decade without detection. Over the years, Elisabeth's confinement became more complex as Joseph Fritzl sought to exert complete control over every aspect of her existence. She had no access to outside communication. Letters, phones, or any contact with the broader world were strictly forbidden. Investigators later described how he monitored her movements within the basement, allowing her only to move between the small rooms he had prepared. The basement included a rudimentary toilet and washing area, but Joseph determined when she could use them, further reinforcing her dependence on him. Elisabeth's psychological state reflected the effects of extreme isolation. According to court documents and later psychological evaluations, she exhibited signs of learned helplessness and chronic anxiety, common in long-term captivity. Her sense of time and normalcy was disrupted. Days and nights blurred together, and she became highly compliant to avoid provoking her father. Experts noted that these conditions created an environment in which escape or resistance seemed impossible, effectively conditioning her to accept the confinement. Despite the severity of her situation, Elisabeth managed to survive the basic physical challenges of confinement. Food was provided sporadically, often limited in quantity and variety, but sufficient to sustain life. She endured years of deprivation, fear, and psychological torment, a testament to both the resilience of the human body and the cruel efficiency of her captor's control. Throughout this period, Joseph maintained his public persona. He worked at his factory job, interacted socially, and presented himself as a responsible father and husband. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues saw nothing amiss. Unaware that beneath the family home, Elisabeth endured conditions that would later be described as prison-like. The combination of Joseph's meticulous planning, the basement's hidden structure, and Elisabeth's psychological conditioning allowed this extreme abuse to continue undetected for decades. During her years in the basement, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children, 3 of whom were kept with her in the confined space. The pregnancies began as early as 1984, within the first year of her imprisonment. Joseph Fritzl's control extended to every aspect of these births, carefully managing when and how Elisabeth could access medical care, often under false pretenses to outside authorities. Medical records indicate that some births were reported as emergencies, with Joseph claiming that Elisabeth was a patient in need of urgent care. She was taken to hospitals sporadically, but visits were tightly controlled. Doctors and nurses were generally unaware of the full context, as Joseph fabricated explanations for her condition and limited the information provided. At times, the children born in captivity were immediately removed from Elisabeth and raised by Joseph in the family home, separated from her entirely, while others remained with her in the basement under his supervision. The living conditions for Elisabeth and the children who remained with her were extremely harsh. The basement's small rooms were adapted for their presence but offered minimal space, poor ventilation, and limited light. Basic nutrition and hygiene were provided, but these were entirely regulated by Joseph. Investigators later noted that the combination of confinement, repeated pregnancies, and child-rearing under such conditions inflicted profound physical and psychological stress on Elisabeth. Joseph maintained a careful cover for the existence of these children. To neighbors and authorities, their presence was explained through fabricated stories. Some were said to have been sent away for adoption, others claimed to be living elsewhere with relatives. No social services or medical authorities detected the pattern of repeated pregnancies under suspicious circumstances, reflecting both the meticulous planning of Joseph Fritzl and the lack of oversight from local institutions. The births in captivity represented a particularly extreme dimension of Joseph Fritzl's abuse. Elisabeth's forced pregnancies were both a tool of control and a consequence of the prolonged captivity that had begun nearly 2 decades earlier. Each birth deepened her isolation, tethering her more firmly to the basement and her father's dominance, while simultaneously creating layers of deception that concealed the full scope of the crime from the outside world. The impact of these births on Elisabeth's physical and psychological state was severe. Court documents and expert analyses later described the repeated pregnancies as a form of extreme physical coercion. Elisabeth endured the strain of pregnancy, childbirth, and childcare entirely under the watchful control of her father, with no autonomy over her body or environment. The children who remained with her were confined in the same oppressive conditions, growing up in darkness, with limited space and minimal stimulation. Joseph Fritzl maintained rigid routines around these births. He determined when Elisabeth could receive any medical attention, how the children were fed, and even when they could move within the basement. Investigators noted that the pattern of repeated pregnancies was a deliberate strategy to keep Elisabeth physically weakened and psychologically dependent. Each birth reinforced his control, tying her more tightly to the basement and diminishing her chances of escape. To outsiders, the births remained concealed. Joseph provided selective explanations to medical personnel, neighbors, and authorities, claiming that the children were elsewhere or had been adopted. Hospital records show inconsistencies in the information provided, reflecting deliberate deception. No local institutions connected the dots despite the repeated need for hospital visits and emergency care, illustrating both the effectiveness of Joseph's manipulations and systemic oversights in child protection and medical reporting at the time. The cumulative effect of confinement and repeated childbirth left Elisabeth profoundly isolated and physically vulnerable. Psychologists later emphasized that the trauma of forced pregnancies, combined with ongoing captivity, had lasting effects on her mental and emotional well-being. Each birth in the basement was both a new layer of abuse and a further entrenchment of Joseph Fritzl's total control over her life. Joseph Fritzl's control extended beyond the basement, shaping the entire narrative of Elisabeth's life to outsiders. He meticulously manipulated hospitals, social services, and neighbors to conceal the existence of his daughter's captivity and the children born in the basement. Each hospital visit for childbirth was orchestrated to provide minimal information, often portraying Elisabeth as a patient whose circumstances were private or unusual, but not suspicious. Medical staff, unaware of the full context, accepted his explanations without question. Within the household, Joseph maintained strict routines and rules. Elisabeth and the children who lived with her were isolated in darkness and silence for much of the day, with movement carefully restricted. He monitored their activities, enforced schedules, and ensured that any communication, even minor expressions of frustration or fear, was met with intimidation. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance was profound, leaving Elisabeth dependent and fearful of her father's authority. To further conceal the crimes, Joseph created false narratives about the children. Those removed from the basement were presented as children sent away for adoption or cared for by relatives, while those who remained were effectively hidden from anyone who might inquire. Neighbors and extended family accepted these explanations, as Joseph's reputation as a polite, law-abiding citizen discouraged suspicion. Even local authorities were unaware of the pattern of repeated pregnancies, partly because Joseph limited medical information and contacts to prevent any official scrutiny. Investigators later described the system of control as highly sophisticated. Joseph combined physical confinement with psychological manipulation, deception, and selective disclosure to maintain secrecy. The basement was only one element. The social and institutional concealment was equally critical. This dual strategy ensured that Elisabeth's imprisonment, along with the births and daily abuse, remained entirely hidden for decades, demonstrating a level of premeditation and cunning that enabled the crime to persist undetected. The layers of deception Joseph Fritzl constructed were not limited to medical institutions and neighbors. He also manipulated official records to obscure the presence of the children and the pregnancies. Birth certificates, hospital forms, and identification documents were falsified or selectively withheld, ensuring that no pattern would be detected. For the children who remained with Elisabeth, Joseph controlled every detail of their lives. From the basic necessities he provided to the ways they were allowed to move within the basement. Investigators later emphasized that this tight control over both records and daily life was essential to maintaining secrecy. Elisabeth's ability to seek help was systematically blocked. She was psychologically conditioned through fear and isolation to comply with her father's demands. Even if she had attempted to escape or contact authorities, the design of the basement, combined with her father's dominance, made it nearly impossible. The absence of windows, reinforced doors, and hidden access points ensured she could not be seen or heard from outside, while Joseph's monitoring of her movements and limited exposure to the outside world maintained her psychological dependence. Neighbors and extended family remained unaware of the ongoing abuse. Joseph continued to cultivate his image as a responsible, ordinary man, visiting workplaces, participating in social activities, and presenting a functional family life. The contrast between this public persona and the hidden reality in the basement allowed the crimes to remain undetected for decades. Experts later described the combination of physical confinement, deception, and psychological manipulation as a textbook case of extreme coercive control. Through careful orchestration of both social and institutional concealment, Joseph ensured that Elisabeth's imprisonment and the existence of her children remained entirely hidden. The sophisticated, multi-layered strategies he employed demonstrate not only premeditation but also an understanding of the gaps in oversight within the community, hospitals, and social services at the time. The hidden imprisonment of Elisabeth Fritzl began to unravel in April 2008, when one of the children born in the basement fell seriously ill. Elisabeth took the child to a local hospital in Amstetten, seeking urgent medical attention. Medical staff, noticing inconsistencies in her account and concern for the child's welfare, began asking questions that eventually led to the revelation of her long-term captivity. Elisabeth disclosed to doctors that she and some of her children had been confined in a basement for years, and the hospital promptly alerted the police. Authorities responded quickly, arriving at the Fritzl residence to investigate. Joseph Fritzl initially attempted to maintain his facade, but the forensic examination of the basement confirmed Elisabeth's account. Police discovered a complex network of rooms, reinforced doors, and hidden access points designed to prevent escape and conceal the inhabitants. Investigators found evidence of prolonged habitation, including clothing, bedding, and supplies for Elisabeth and her children, and documented the extreme conditions of confinement. Eyewitness accounts from neighbors and local acquaintances highlighted Joseph Fritzl's careful management of appearances. Despite Elisabeth's prolonged absence and the unusual circumstances of repeated hospital visits for childbirth, No one had previously suspected abuse. Joseph's reputation in the community as a polite, law-abiding man, combined with the sophistication of the basement's concealment, had successfully masked the crime for decades. Official reports later detailed the immediate interventions taken by authorities. Elisabeth and the children were moved to safe locations and provided with medical and psychological care. Experts documented the severe physical and psychological consequences of long-term captivity, including developmental delays in the children who had spent formative years in isolation. The discovery of the basement shocked Austria and the world, highlighting both the extreme cruelty of Joseph Fritzl's actions and the systemic failures that allowed such abuse to remain undetected for so long. After Elisabeth's disclosure at the hospital, authorities quickly pieced together the scope of the abuse. Police conducted a thorough forensic examination of the Fritzl residence, focusing on the concealed basement. They documented the reinforced doors, hidden entry points, and the small rooms where Elisabeth and the children had lived for years. Investigators also recovered clothing, bedding, and basic supplies, providing clear evidence of long-term habitation under oppressive conditions. Officials interviewed neighbors, family members, and acquaintances to understand the extent of the secrecy. Most were stunned. Joseph Fritzl's outward image as a polite, law-abiding citizen had effectively masked decades of abuse. Neighbors recalled that while Elisabeth had been unusually withdrawn and had limited social contact, they had no reason to suspect imprisonment or repeated pregnancies. Medical personnel were questioned about past hospital visits, and records revealed inconsistencies in the explanations provided by Joseph, which had previously gone unchallenged. Social services reviewed the case to understand how such prolonged captivity could have gone undetected. Experts noted systemic gaps: absence of coordinated oversight, lack of follow-up on repeated hospital admissions, and the community's trust in Joseph Fritzl's respectable public persona all contributed to the prolonged concealment. The discovery highlighted both the extreme premeditation of Joseph Fritzl and the missed opportunities by authorities to intervene earlier. Elisabeth and the children were immediately taken to safe locations and provided with medical care, nutrition, and psychological support. Forensic reports and expert assessments documented the profound physical and emotional toll of years in isolation, including trauma, developmental delays in the children, and signs of chronic stress and anxiety in Elisabeth. The revelation of the basement's existence and the details of Joseph Fritzl's crimes drew international attention, sparking widespread outrage and intense media coverage. Following the discovery of Elisabeth and the children, authorities moved swiftly to arrest Joseph Fritzl. He was taken into custody in April 2008 at his home in Amstetten. Initially, Fritzl attempted to maintain his public facade, claiming that he had been unaware of the full circumstances. However, during interrogations, he eventually confessed to imprisoning his daughter in the basement for 24 years and fathering several children with her. Police reports indicate that Fritzl's confession was detailed and methodical. He acknowledged the construction of the basement, the prolonged confinement, and the multiple births. Investigators noted the chilling premeditation evident in his account. He described planning the basement's design, controlling Elisabeth's movements, and fabricating stories to explain her absence to neighbors and authorities. Forensic examinations of the basement confirmed the conditions he described, including reinforced doors, hidden access points, minimal ventilation, and areas adapted for sleeping, living, and child-rearing. Eyewitness accounts from neighbors and relatives emphasized the contrast between Fritzl's public persona and the private reality. He had maintained the appearance of a normal family man, which had contributed to the long-term concealment of the crimes. Authorities documented the sophisticated nature of the deception, noting that his outward respectability had masked decades of abuse, allowing the imprisonment to go undetected. Official reports also detailed the immediate steps taken to secure the victims. Elisabeth and the children were placed in safe locations and provided with medical and psychological care. The police collected extensive forensic evidence from the basement and surrounding property, which later became critical in the trial. Fritzl remained in custody under heavy security, and Austrian authorities coordinated with social services and mental health professionals to ensure ongoing support for the survivors. The confession marked a pivotal moment in the case. It transformed Elisabeth's disclosure from an isolated hospital report into a criminal investigation with irrefutable evidence, setting the stage for prosecution and public reckoning. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and Fritzl's own admission provided a comprehensive record of the abuse that would form the basis of his conviction. After his initial confession, Joseph Fritzl's statements were corroborated by forensic evidence and medical reports. Investigators documented the basement in detail: reinforced walls, multiple locked rooms, and a system designed to prevent escape. Items recovered included clothing, bedding, and supplies that had been stockpiled to sustain Elisabeth and the children over many years. The physical evidence aligned with Fritzl's account, confirming the extreme conditions of confinement and his meticulous planning. Authorities also examined hospital records and previous medical visits, uncovering inconsistencies in the explanations Fritzl had provided over the years. For example, multiple emergency admissions for childbirth had been explained as individual, unrelated events, without raising suspicion. Police concluded that Fritzl had carefully fabricated these stories to avoid detection, exploiting gaps in medical oversight and the trust of the community. Interviews with neighbors and extended family highlighted the effectiveness of his public deception. Most were unaware of Elisabeth's prolonged absence, and those who had noted her isolation accepted his explanations or assumed she had moved elsewhere. Joseph's outward appearance as a reliable, law-abiding citizen had provided cover for decades of abuse, a factor authorities cited as critical in understanding why the crime remained hidden for so long. Elisabeth and the children were provided with immediate medical and psychological care. Specialists documented significant trauma, including chronic anxiety, developmental delays in the children, and long-term emotional effects on Elisabeth. Fritzl remained in custody, facing charges of incest, rape, false imprisonment, and other related crimes. His detailed confessions, combined with physical and testimonial evidence, created a robust case for prosecution and ensured that the extent of his crimes could be fully verified. The arrest and confession marked the transition from discovery to legal accountability, exposing the full scale of Joseph Fritzl's decades-long abuse. The case became a global reference point for understanding extreme confinement, psychological manipulation, and systemic failures in detecting prolonged abuse within seemingly normal households. Joseph Fritzl's trial began in March 2009 at the Krems Regional Court in Austria. The proceedings drew intense national and international attention, as the details of Elisabeth's captivity and the children born in the basement became public for the first time. He faced multiple charges, including incest, rape, enslavement, coercion, and false imprisonment. The case was widely regarded as one of the most severe and prolonged instances of abuse in modern European history. During the trial, prosecutors presented a comprehensive case supported by physical evidence, medical records, witness testimony, and Fritzl's own confessions. Forensic examinations of the basement revealed the reinforced doors, hidden access points, and living conditions that had confined Elisabeth and some of her children for decades. Hospital and birth records corroborated the timeline of pregnancies and the deliberate deception used to conceal them from authorities. Eyewitness accounts from neighbors, teachers, and extended family emphasized the contrast between Fritzl's public persona and the hidden reality of his household. Experts in psychology and criminology testified about the long-term effects of isolation, forced pregnancies, and psychological manipulation on Elisabeth and the children. The court also reviewed social service records, highlighting missed opportunities to detect abuse and systemic failures in oversight. In March 2009, Joseph Fritzl was found guilty on all counts. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment, reflecting both the severity and duration of his crimes. The verdict was widely reported in international media, prompting discussions on child protection, mandatory reporting, and psychological consequences of long-term captivity. Elisabeth and her children were granted protection and continued access to medical and psychological care. The trial reinforced the importance of forensic investigation, cross-institutional oversight, and careful documentation in cases of prolonged abuse. The case became a benchmark for understanding extreme coercive control, revealing how a combination of psychological manipulation, technical concealment, and systemic oversight failures can allow abuse to persist for decades. The trial also highlighted the intricate methods Joseph Fritzl used to maintain secrecy over decades. Prosecutors presented evidence of the basement's construction, emphasizing how its design, including reinforced walls, locked doors, and hidden access points, enabled prolonged concealment. Hospital records and testimony from medical staff revealed how Fritzl manipulated explanations for Elisabeth's repeated pregnancies, fabricating stories that prevented suspicion from forming. The court examined these details alongside social and community accounts, illustrating how his outward respectability masked years of systematic abuse. Psychologists testified about the profound and lasting effects of Elisabeth's confinement. She had endured extreme isolation, repeated pregnancies, and forced motherhood under conditions that would have caused severe trauma for anyone. Experts noted that the children who remained in the basement during critical developmental years had also experienced deprivation, limited socialization, and emotional stress, though they were remarkably resilient under the circumstances. The court weighed this evidence carefully in determining the appropriate sentence. The proceedings underscored systemic failures in oversight and protection. Despite multiple hospital visits, neighbor observations, and gaps in Elisabeth's social life, no intervention had occurred over the years. The trial prompted reflection on the need for improved child protection measures, cross-institutional communication, and vigilance in identifying subtle signs of long-term abuse. When the court handed down its life sentence, it signaled both legal accountability and societal condemnation of the extraordinary violations committed over decades. Fritzl was immediately taken into custody, and his imprisonment ensured that he could no longer threaten the victims. Elisabeth and her children, meanwhile, were provided ongoing support to recover from the trauma. The trial and sentencing became a landmark case in European criminal justice, demonstrating the convergence of meticulous investigation, forensic evidence, and survivor testimony in addressing crimes of extreme domestic abuse. The discovery of Elisabeth Fritzl's captivity and the trial of Joseph Fritzl had profound social and legal repercussions in Austria and beyond. The case sparked international attention, exposing the extreme consequences of prolonged domestic abuse and the vulnerabilities in systems meant to protect children and vulnerable adults. Psychologists, social workers, and legal experts highlighted the case as a landmark example of coercive control, demonstrating how isolation, manipulation, and secrecy can allow abuse to persist undetected for decades. In Austria, the case prompted reviews of child protection policies and procedures. Social services examined gaps in oversight that had allowed repeated hospital visits and unusual absences to go unchallenged. Discussions around mandatory reporting, cross-agency communication, and monitoring of unusual medical or social patterns were strengthened. Legal experts cited the Fritzl case when considering reforms to ensure that extreme confinement and sexual abuse within families could be detected earlier. Media coverage and documentaries brought widespread awareness to issues of long-term abuse, isolation, and psychological manipulation. Survivors of similar abuse reported that the case validated their experiences and encouraged them to come forward. Elisabeth and her children, under protective measures, received ongoing medical and psychological care. Their gradual reintegration into society highlighted both the resilience of victims and the long-term challenges of recovering from decades of captivity. The case also influenced international discourse on the detection and prevention of domestic abuse. Researchers studied the combination of psychological conditioning, technical concealment, and systemic oversight failures that allowed Joseph Fritzl's crimes to continue, contributing to literature on coercive control and long-term imprisonment within familial settings. It remains a reference point for law enforcement, social services, and mental health professionals worldwide. Ultimately, the legacy of the case lies not only in the legal accountability of Joseph Fritzl, but also in the broader societal lessons it provided: the necessity of vigilance, the importance of institutional oversight, and the recognition of psychological abuse as a form of extreme control with long-lasting consequences. The world's awareness of the case continues to shape policies, professional practices, and public understanding of prolonged domestic abuse and confinement. From the shadows of that basement to the light of the outside world, this story leaves us with haunting questions about secrecy, survival, and the strength of the human spirit. If you want more stories told in this way, make sure to like the video, Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for the next one, only on Eternal Obsidian.